Your Best Life Now, written by Joel Osteen, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 years and has reportedly sold over 8 million copies. As a result, it has become a punching bag for most every cessationist and reformed apologist out there. With that in mind, I set out to discover what the book and the controversy it spawned were all about. I got a copy of the book a while back and read it, and I have to say, I still don't see what all the fuss is about. It's basically a bunch of stories told in a way to illustrate biblical principles for success, fulfillment, and healing. There is surely no deep theology in this or any other book by Osteen, but neither is there any heresy. I decided to do a video about the book to let people know my thoughts on the matter, but before I do, I should give you some background on Joel and his church. Joel Osteen's father was a famous charismatic preacher named John Osteen. In 1981, I went to Houston, Texas for what was called a ministers' summit at John Osteen's Lakewood Church. The speakers were T.L. Osborne, Norval Hayes, Lester Sumrall, Kenneth Hagin, and of course the host, John Osteen. It was the first time I saw any of these men, and it was an incredible experience. A year or so later, I saw John Osteen again in Tulsa at Kenneth Hagin's camp meeting. I always enjoyed hearing him speak. He was both funny and inspirational. He had an amazing story of being a Baptist preacher who discovered that God still does miracles when we believe and act on His Word. As a former Baptist myself, I could really relate to his message. When his daughter was diagnosed with a condition similar to cerebral palsy as an infant, John and his wife Dodie anointed her with oil and prayed for healing. Although there was no immediate change, they thanked God for hearing their prayer and healing their baby girl. They continued to do so for months and years as she progressively improved. By the time she entered high school, the symptoms had all vanished and she was completely healed. As a result of this miracle, John's world had been turned completely upside down. He received the baptism in the Holy Spirit and began speaking in tongues, and after sharing his experiences with his Baptist congregation, he was forced out of his position and ended up starting Lakewood Baptist Church, which is now Lakewood Church, in Houston in 1959. In 1981, Dodie was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors did all they could do to help her, but they finally gave her the bad news that she only had a few weeks or maybe a few months to live. But instead of just resigning herself to fate, she started meditating on what God says about healing and kept speaking the word continually, day after day, week after week, month after month, until the cancer was gone. She's still alive today. This is the essential background for understanding everything that is happening today with Joel Osteen's ministry and Lakewood Church, a church that was birthed in the miraculous and has become by far the largest church in America. Everything Joel has done in ministry is built upon what his parents established over the 40 years they were running the church. And now for the analysis of the book. Let's start with the book's title, Your Best Life Now. Believe it or not, this seems to be the biggest beef from the book's critics. They absolutely despise that title. In fact, I'm convinced that most of the critics haven't really read beyond that title. The typical comment is something like, "The only way to have your best life now is if you're going to hell." Very clever, but it's a total distortion of the real meaning. You see, there's also a subtitle to the book that goes, 7 Steps to Living at Your Full Potential. The title isn't referring to having our best life in this life as opposed to the afterlife. It's talking about putting biblical principles into action now to bring about positive changes now, rather than sitting around all depressed and hoping that someday things will get better. Let's listen to what Joel says in the introduction.
Many people go through life with low self-esteem, focusing on the negative, feeling inferior or inadequate, always dwelling on some reason why they can't be happy. Others put off their happiness to some future date. Someday things will get better in my life. Someday I'll be caught up with my work long enough to enjoy making memories with my family. Someday I'll earn enough money that I won't have to worry about how I can pay the bills. Someday I'm going to get in better physical condition. Someday I'll have a better relationship with God and enjoy more of His goodness. Today is the only day we have. We can't do anything about the past, and we don't know what the future holds, but we can live at our full potential right now.
So you can see how his opponents took him out of context on the book's title, which is actually quite typical of these guys. He then lays out those 7 steps. Number 1, enlarge your vision. Number 2, develop a healthy self-image. Number 3, discover the power of your thoughts and words. Number 4, let go of the past. Number 5, find strength through adversity. Number 6, live to give. And number 7, choose to be happy. So far, so good. No violations of the central Christian doctrines that I can see. So let's dive into the actual content to see what mischief Joel Osteen might be up to. In Enlarge Your Vision, Joel tells the story of Tara Holland, the 1997 Miss America pageant winner. She tried and failed twice to win her state's pageant and was tempted to quit, but instead she chose to do everything she could to see herself winning that pageant, and finally she achieved her goal. Now, some might say that visualization is an unbiblical concept and that it comes from the East, but they forget that the Bible was written in the East. And there are several references in the Bible to visualization, although it may not be called that. Hebrews 11:10 says of Abraham, "For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Well, there's no city in the physical realm built by God. All of the cities on earth were built by man. So if Abraham was looking for a city built by God, he wasn't looking with his physical eyes. He was looking with the eyes of his spirit, the eyes of faith. Then in verse 27 it says that Moses left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Well, since you can't see what is unseen with your physical eyes, it must be talking about visualizing through the eyes of faith. Another example is when the Apostle Paul said, "We walk by faith, not by sight," in 2 Corinthians 5:7. In other words, we don't go by what our physical eyes tell us, but by what we see through our spiritual eyes. For those of you out there who think that visualization is wrong, I suppose you don't visualize Jesus on the cross when you're taking communion. Of course you do. That's the way our brains work. And God gave us our imagination and the ability to visualize for a reason. In fact, you could make the argument that Jesus used visualization, because Hebrews 11:2 tells us that he endured the cross because of the joy set before him. Yes, visualization is practiced in the New Age and other religions, but that doesn't make it wrong. What makes the other belief systems wrong is their rejection of Jesus as the only way to heaven, not the fact that they visualize. In step 2, develop a healthy self-image, Joel talks about the need to see yourself as God sees you, not as others see you. When Israel's 12 spies saw the giants in Canaan, 10 of them saw themselves as grasshoppers compared to the Canaanites, but since God had promised them the land, their comparative size was irrelevant. The same thing is true of David, who was dismissed by Goliath as a dog. Then there was Gideon, who God referred to as a mighty man of valor despite his poor self-image. Gideon went on to become a great military leader, judge, and prophet. The point is, we need to see ourselves as children of God rather than as weak people who will probably be defeated by whatever we face in life. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world, 1 John 4:4. Romans 15:4 tells us that these stories were written for our benefit, to give us hope and encouragement. So I believe that we can learn about the benefits of a positive, word-based self-image from these stories. The one problem that I have with this section is the story he tells of a man who was trapped in a refrigerated boxcar and froze to death. It seems that the refrigeration unit wasn't even turned on, and the temperature outside was only 61 degrees. In effect, he froze to death because he believed he was freezing to death. That sounded a bit hard to believe, and as I checked the story out, I discovered that it's just an urban legend. Snopes said that it's a popular story told by motivational speakers because it emphasizes the power of the mind for good or bad. But in this case, I think the power of the mind should be harnessed and focused on critical thinking. While the point he was making may have had some merit, this nearly ruined the whole book for me. At least I know that most of his stories are true because they're told in the first person. Oh well, on to step 3. In the first part of step 3, Joel talks about the power of our thoughts and how important it is that we dwell on pleasant thoughts rather than discouraging thoughts. Nothing unbiblical there because Paul told us to do exactly that in Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Let Go of the Past, Step 4, contains one of the most controversial parts of the book, the story of a couple who lost their only son in a work accident. This couple clung to their grief year after year, and their friends eventually began to distance themselves from the couple to preserve their own sanity. 15 years after the tragedy, they found their identities in their loss and their grief. And Joel says that they don't want to get well. The book's critics think it's insensitive for him to tell people to just get over it after what they've been through. But I think 15 years is certainly long enough to get on with your life and realize that you're not the only one who has ever experienced a loss like that. It doesn't mean that you don't miss the person or feel the pain. It just means that if you want to have a better future, you have to be willing to let go of the past. Joel then tells the story of his father's passing and how he had to make the decision to dwell on the good times they had together rather than the loss. He cherished his dad. Joel Osteen was not only his father, but his pastor, his employer, and his friend. I think people forget sometimes that Joel has experienced tragedy himself, and yet he chose to have a positive outlook and took over his dad's church, taking the congregation from less than 10,000 to over 40,000 members. Letting go of the past is indeed necessary if you want to make something of your future. Find Strength Through Adversity, Step 5, follows up on the theme of Step 4. Here he tells the story of expanding the broadcast ministry of Lakewood after his dad passed. Bringing triumph out of tragedy is a very biblical principle. In fact, that's what the gospel is. It's God taking the fall of man and using it as a way to display his grace and mercy before all creation for all eternity. Step 6, Live to Give, is probably the least controversial step of the 7. I mean, who would want to criticize Joel for saying that we need to be generous with our giving? And yet, some of the critics want to make this into give to get. Actually, he spends most of this section talking about giving a smile, a hug, helping the poor, reaching out to hurting people, or just being kind to somebody who isn't necessarily kind to you. Joel's church, Lakewood, has always had a reputation for being there for the community in times of disaster. He tells the story of Tropical Storm Allison and the role Lakewood played in getting assistance to the victims of the storm. It's so ironic that Lakewood would become the object of such scorn during Hurricane Harvey. People who aren't familiar with Houston don't realize that the main road to the church, Highway 59, was underwater. They got 3 feet of rain in 3 days. And as soon as it was safe for them to open the doors, they began functioning as a distribution center per the city's request. And when the convention center downtown reached capacity, they acted as a backup shelter for storm victims. Lakewood has always been there for the people of Houston, going back to the 1970s when they exploded into a megachurch. It's too bad that people with petty jealousy and anti-Christian sentiments tried to drag Joel down when he had done nothing wrong other than maybe mishandling the public relations. Step 7. Happiness is a choice. Okay, I finally found the heresy in this book. In this section, Joel talks about keeping your car clean. You've heard of Gnosticism and Arianism and Pelagianism. Well, now Joel Osteen is teaching the heresy of clean carism. Heretic! Burn him! All kidding aside, Joel includes a notes section in the back of the book with well over 100 verses referenced throughout the book. So we have scripture galore and no violations of essential Christian doctrine. So what is it that makes these critics want to treat Joel Osteen like a piñata? Well, I think it could be summed up in one word: success. Joel has the largest church in the country by far. His book sales are in the tens of millions. He has the #1 rated inspirational television show. His smiling face can be seen just about everywhere, and he's a charismatic, the son of a famous Word of Faith preacher who was a close friend of Kenneth Hagin. That just drives his cessationist Reformed opponents bat-dung crazy. I dare say that if the same book had been written by the pastor of a church of, say, 1,000 people, nobody would care what was in it. If the book's sales were 8,000 instead of 8 million, nobody would care what it says. But the fact that Joel Osteen's theology rubs them the wrong way, coupled with the fact that he's so incredibly successful, is just too much. But why is he so successful? Well, I think it's because Joel talks about real people and real issues that real people face. And he talks about them like a regular guy. He doesn't bog people down in theological terminology and convoluted constructs that they can't relate to. He talks about addictions, marriages, kids, finances, jobs, tragedies, challenges, and bad habits. He gives people hope and encouragement from God's Word, and people respond to that. Contrast that with this line from one of his critics in an anti-Word of Faith book I read recently. Evangelical Christianity affirms the Trinity and Chalcedonian Christology and eschews all forms of apotheosis. Apple what? Now, who wouldn't want to sit in church and listen to that lingo for half an hour every Sunday? Now, don't misunderstand me. Joel has his weaknesses, especially in the areas of theology and apologetics, where I'd really like to see some improvement. But none of his opponents come anywhere near connecting with people the way that Osteen does. It's a gift that they don't have, and the gifts that they do have don't seem to attract the crowds that he does. Overall, Your Best Life Now isn't a bad book, but I don't know that I would have bought a copy other than to report on it. It's a bit light on theology and a bit heavy on anecdotal fluff, but error? Heresy? No way. You say, well, he's not balanced. Well, what business is that of yours? Do you attend his church? No? Then it's not really any of your business, is it? When he starts violating essential Christian doctrine, then you would have every right to sound the alarm. But until then, I think your time might be better served by studying what Joel is doing right, and maybe incorporating some of that into your approach. For Jew and Greek, this is Rod Saunders. Thanks for watching.